All right. So Secretary Pertl, thank you for joining us today for this conversation and presentation to talk about the governor's budget and its connection and really, the meat of this is around early childhood education and education in the state of Wisconsin. When we reached out, it was to talk about, some of the proposals that were outlined in the governor's budget and how they impact business, how they impact ultimately the state of Wisconsin, and the landscape for the workforce, for the business community, for families. We know the governor's proposals have he'll have an uphill battle in the legislature, and so that's hopefully part of the conversation that we wanted to have today. Uh,
Yeah.
and so, I mean, first and foremost, we've heard from you in the past before, but I just wanted to share a little bit about you for folks who don't know. Secretary Pertl was appointed by the governor back in September of 2024 to serve as the DCF Secretary of, or after serving as the Deputy Secretary of DCF for a number of years. I think it was five or 6 years prior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost 6. Mhm.
6 years, and spending many years working in the public sector prior to that. So I won't do the full rundown of the bio because folks can read that online, obviously. But we definitely appreciate having you with us today to share some insights in terms of where we are in this ECE landscape and with the proposals that the governor has. And so I guess with that, I'll turn it over to you to kind of share a little bit about the governor's proposals and what's kind of in the proposal as it stands right now.
Yeah. So I think, there's a couple pieces, and let me time check for a little bit. We want to do 15 minutes or so, maybe on the front end here, and then some time for questions. How do you want to navigate the conversation?
Yeah. We'll go about 15, 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions for some folks online. I've got some questions here as well. If we have a little bit of silence or not, we'll see. But yeah, let's go that way.
Great. Well, we're all friends here. So I think, let me level set and say that I think we are having very good conversations with policymakers in both parties about childcare. And there is very broad, I think, consensus that childcare is challenging, is in crisis. I think people recognize a couple things that we've been talking about, that I've talked to you all about before. But really the challenge for young families. And, the way I tend to think about this is, you're not supposed to have more than 30% of your income tied up in housing. Most of us can't do that anymore. I couldn't afford to buy my own house anymore. Statewide, a kid in childcare is about 20% of a family's income. 2 kids would be 40%. In Milwaukee, it's 30% a kid. So if you're a young family with 2 kids in Milwaukee, you'd have 60% of your, average household income tied up in childcare. If you could keep your housing to 30%, that's still 90 cents of every dollar in Milwaukee, 70 cents statewide, that you've got spent before you do anything else, before you pay that student loan or buy gas or utilities or groceries or your cell phone, all the other things you need to do just to make life work. So the math doesn't math for young families, and it's why people are having kids older. It's why they're having fewer kids. They're making different decisions. And that's a thing that concerns everybody, regardless of sort of where they sit ideologically. And so the way that I would say the price of housing, declining wages, childcare, student loan debt start to stack up on young families is a compelling way to think and talk about this. What does it take for people to thrive? We want young families to be successful. And so this idea also that childcare is very expensive for families. Wages are incredibly low, $750 in family care, $1350 in center-based care, with really tight margins. And we got fewer providers today, although we've got more slots, so more capacity, but in fewer locations. And so that creates problems, particularly in our rural areas. And so in kind of thinking about those lenses, I think we've really brought people along in a conversation about what are we going to do about this? Why is this important? So I think I talked to you last time about sort of three big buckets. So I talked about Wisconsin Shares is a strategy around working families. It's super important. It's a means tested subsidy for families to be able to buy childcare. It's about 200% of federal poverty for eligibility. And just for context, Head Start's at like 100, school vouchers are at 300. Childcare kind of sits in the middle of means tested programs for a lot of folks. And there's really two things we care about there. Eligibility, so that who is in the universe by income, and then this thing we call sort of the market rate that it covers. And so we try to set this at the 75th percentile. And what that means is, across the state, 75% childcare slots would be covered. The price we pay on the subsidy would cover the cost in those areas. That number dips too low, people stop participating in shares because they're not getting paid enough for the childcare work, and they'll take market rate kids. Half of the kids in shares are in Milwaukee. It's a huge impact in the Milwaukee community. It's the largest, sort of area participating in the program. So working families, talking a lot about business partnerships, savings accounts, tax credits, what we can do to sort of partner with business to help sort of bring them in. That's a big thing that Republicans are concerned about, saying the governor's put up proposals on, and sort of, fitting those two things together. And then really talking about the other two buckets are provider side strategies. That's where childcare counts is. Childcare counts had two parts, right? It had sort of what we call part A, which was what we call administrative money. You can build a fence with it. You can pay rent. You can pay salary. You can do whatever you need to do. And part B, that was a wage supplement. And there seems to be a lot of interest. Childcare counts, the term, is the majority is not in favor of. They tell me all day, and I chuckle, and we hug it out about how finance did approve this like 7 times, and childcare counts is actually modeled on per pupil aid, which is a Republican policy idea, and then we all sort of laugh about that. But look, the politics of that is they're not going to pass something called childcare counts, and that's okay. Like, we understand that. What the conversation about is really, what is a provider side strategy? Sort of what does the majority in the legislature see on the provider side that makes sense to them? And how do we sort of work toward a workable solution on that? And there's a lot of conversations about either like a wage strategy, so something that really focuses on what we would think of as Part B for childcare counts, but a wage supplement. The legislature did do something in elder care on that in the last legislative session. And so there's kind of a model and a precedent for doing something in a care related field around that. And I think that there's some political interest there. There's also a lot of interest around infants and toddlers. They have the tightest ratios. It's the most expensive. There's some real interest, particularly in rural areas and in family care, and what can we do about that? The other thing there's a lot of interest in is sort of the way 4-year-old kindergarten has impacted childcare. Everybody loves 4-year-old kindergarten. Parents love it in part because you go from paying for childcare to what feels like free, right? School is free. You pay for it through the property tax and other tax mechanisms. You're not writing a check out of your pocket like you do when you go to childcare. Helps declining enrollment districts. It builds alignment around literacy and other things. But it bankrupts childcare. It takes the least expensive kids out of the mix. We took a whole segment of them. We moved them over into this publicly financed system. And it really left behind an unstable business model and market. And so those are the sort of, on the provider side, the 3 things I would say the majority talks about the most: wage supplements, infant care, something around 4-year-olds and maybe 4-year-old kindergarten. And then having some conversations around, what can we do on regulation? There's some progress that we've made on that front. We've had some productive conversations. So in the macro, people are very engaged. I've talked with almost all the senators, the finance committee members. I'm talking with the speaker tomorrow. We're meeting with WMC. We're talking to business leaders. We're really helping steward a conversation that I think is about childcare providers, but really is centered around families. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second. There are some other like nuts and bolts things in the governor's budget that aren't what I would say the big conversation about childcare, but also matter to people that I can talk a little bit about now that the governor's budget's out. But any thoughts you got there, Langston, before I keep moving forward?
Yeah, as my initial thought was, how far away are we already from the governor's initial proposal? Now, I know the governor has a initial proposal, and a lot of that gets, for lack of a better term, thrown in the trash, and we kind of start from a lot of different, it's not necessarily from scratch, but we essentially start from scratch, or we start from variations of that, right? How far away are we already from the governor's original proposal? And that, may be a good thing, maybe not, but how far away are we from that?
I think there's a shared framework here. Frankly, I think the governor built his proposal kind of around the things that people care about. That way, those buckets I was talking about are pretty shared. Even in the middle lane, we run partner up. The governor proposed sort of a modified version of that that's a little more flexible, a little less, cumbersome, I would say, and can do more on like matching and other things for businesses. So some more flexibility in that lane. Yes, we're proposing childcare counts. I always tell folks that it doesn't make sense for the governor to propose anything else. This is his answer to the question. In him proposing another answer to the question isn't a negotiation. That's just us talking to ourselves. What we got to do is help the majority find their answers to the questions so we can put the puzzle pieces together. That's what a deal is. That's how people kind of find the different components that need to fit together. But the meat of the bone, and to your point, they are 100% going to strip out most of the things in the budget. Nobody should be shocked about that. A lot of those things will come back in. That is sort of the practice of the time we find ourselves in, for better or worse. But a lot of the nuts and bolts things I think are pretty popular. And so let me just flag a couple. So we talked a little bit about shares. There are some policy pieces around shares that I think are very important and frankly pretty popular. In fact, Priya, who's our administrator for early care and education, is in the Capitol talking to folks about this, I think actually right now. And so a couple of things. So one is capping copays at 7% of income. So this is important because, regardless of what's happening with market rates, it would limit what providers could charge for people who are in shares to 7% of their income on the copay. I think that's a broadly popular piece, and it's really designed to sort of, make sure that the subsidy continues to be affordable. A second piece is what we call presumptive eligibility. So this would be when you come and you sign up for shares, we're going to take that at face value. We're going to put you in shares right away. We're going to get you into childcare while we're verifying some of that information. There's things we collect on the front end. Think of it like a quick application. Do you have the right essential pieces? But sometimes there's income verification. There's other things that you got to get information from a bank or an employer. And right now, you can't start your subsidy until all of that paperwork is done. We want to change that process to more of a quick verification, and then we assume that you're good. If it turns out you're not, you got to recover some cost and do some things. But we can move people through this process faster. I think that's super helpful for families that are in crisis, for families that are moving into a new job and they need care. This is about speeding up this process and just frankly making it work better for families. The other thing from a workforce training perspective that I think is very popular is the childcare foundational trainings. We moved to a system. We used to do the old correspondence course. You used to literally send a notebook back and forth as you took a paper and pencil training course. We modernized that. We moved everything online. We aligned the trainings to the technical college. So as you go through this, now you can get technical college credit. You can help work toward your associate's degree as part of this process. But the state started underwriting the cost of that training for a lot of folks. Basically made it free or highly subsidized for people to be able to sort of become licensed for childcare. And it has caused a boom in some areas in terms of being able to sign people up, move them more quickly through the system. And it fits very much with our rural sourcing, sort of anywhere Wisconsin strategy. Think about as long as you got broadband, we can get you trained in childcare. We can get you certified, so we can get you into home-based care or center-based care. Let's take those cost barriers down. This is not a high-wage field. I sort of always say you're better off going to Costco, or you're better off working a Quick Trip than you are caring for someone's child or someone's parent in a lot of cases. So we got to make the barriers low because these are mission-driven folks. The other thing, and this is not in the governor's budget, but I do think this is a popular thing and that we are supportive of, is Kentucky, which is a great state, red legislature, blue governor, lot for us to love in that universe. They make all of their childcare staff eligible for their version of shares. Basically, they pay for childcare regardless of what you're making. And let's be honest, we know you're not making a whole lot, so this is not a big leap. But we can get you covered for childcare, especially if you have a spouse who's earning a little bit more, and that might disrupt your normal shares eligibility. But if you're going to work in childcare, a lot of places are writing off the cost of care for those staffers. Well, we could come in and make them part of the shares program. And I think, again, it's a good example of a bipartisan approach.
Good incentive.
Right. That we can make this work better for people. And so those things have been pretty popular. All of that's in the right sets of lanes, and there are some things. There's the revolving loan fund from last session. There were some other pieces that they liked that the governor doesn't totally love. And I always tell them the same thing. That's how you get to a deal. We put together all the pieces and we fashion it to a package. Those things can all start to make it through.
Yeah. Yeah. And so everything we've talked about so far has been around support for the family members who are utilizing the services, for the childcare operators themselves. What is the business community's role in this currently as it exists? One of the things that I heard early on as I started investigating some of the challenges in early childhood education in Wisconsin, everybody would point me to Michigan and like their Tri-Share program and things like that, where business community would kick in some dollars to help offset some of those expenses. I'm not hearing anything like that here, or any financial obligations or support, unless I'm missing something. Is there a business community role in support?
There is a piece that is very similar to Tri-Share. It's sort of a next-gen version of Partner Up, I would say. It's less restrictive, so the dollars are more flexible in terms of us being able to either partner on buying slots, which is what Partner Up and Tri-Share essentially do in two different states, or in providing some matching funds for different business initiatives. And I think there's a lot of merit in that. We also see some legislation around like technical colleges and school districts being able to provide care or space in certain areas. So we think about these partnerships and how do they work between business, the sort of local government, if you will, and employees. And I think there'll be a push for that. I will tell you that I hear it a lot from legislators that they really think business is ultimately the beneficiary of this childcare piece. I mean, but it's either young families or it's businesses. And so they want to see businesses more engaged in this. The other piece that I think is important about this, though, is that a lot of those things don't function. They're great incubators or moments of innovation in particular locations, but they don't often function very well at scale, right? And so I think at scale, the thing that is most helpful is thinking about how savings accounts and matching funds, so think of childcare a little bit more like a health savings account, as a benefit, right? That you can sort of scale up and down. So Congress has a flex plan that's been in existence since 1980. And it was $6,000 in 1980, and it is, let me check real quick. 44 years later, it's $6,000. So, really kept up with the times and its ability to put that money away. But I use it. I put away $6,000 every year for my kids pre-tax. Now, if we think about this, the legislature has a bill that would do individual savings accounts, which means you don't need it through your employer, a lot like their education savings accounts. But they would let businesses do matches. And in state law, there's a 25% match right now when employers contribute to education savings accounts for their employees or their employees' kids. Okay. Well, if we take that idea and we apply it to childcare, and we started to think, let's say our friends in Congress doubled the contribution, because $12,000 is about what a year of childcare costs in Wisconsin. And, if we took my $6,000 contribution, if my employer matched that, and if the state did 50% on a match to the employer, I could put in my 6. The state would ultimately be in for 3. The employer would be in for 3 because they're getting half of it back from the state. And now my buying power is doubled. Okay. And so what we've really done there is grow the ability. So it's not so much helpful on the access side, but it is much more helpful on the affordability side for families who are paying market rates. And 80% of families are paying the market rate. So it's a huge segment of sort of the process that we need to work through. The other nice thing that's about it is you basically using existing mechanisms. Savings accounts and flex plans are well established policy mechanisms, and they scale. Your employer can match zero. It can match dollar for dollar. It can match 50 cents on the dollar. Small businesses can do it. Large businesses can do it. It's much easier to turn the dial. And so when I start to think about systems, layering on like a benefit structure, really dialing that up, investing in these partnerships that, where there are businesses that want to build slots. If you want to build on-site childcare, there's some federal pieces we can tap into that. If you want to run a more, local initiative, we see a bill about tech colleges being able to do this. We see some interest in revitalizing the UW campuses to do some of this, the 2 years. So there's all these local innovations that we want to foster too, but I also think we want something systemic, and that's going to help more in our urban and suburban areas. It's helpful in our rural areas too. Our rural areas, our biggest challenge is access, though. Affordability is also a challenge, but what you're going to hear from folks is it's great. Doesn't matter if I can afford it, I can't find it. So that's where childcare counts is helpful in sort of layering in that basic level of stability. We got different problems in different parts of the state. We need a solution or sets of solutions that help sort of pull the different levers.
Right. That kind of three-legged stool approach that I know Milwaukee Succeeds had been talking about for quite some time, right? So and you kind of talked about one of my other questions that I had in terms of those tax break or granting opportunity for businesses that were supporting their employees as well. So I'll pause with my questions for a moment and allow you to go on as you or did you have more that you wanted to share related to the governor's budget?
I mean, I think, what we can expect and see, out of the governor's budget is, we see, and this is our biggest challenge. I actually think we've made a lot of progress on the policy levers. Where I think we're going to need to do some work is our level of effort. Right. So we could put a tax credit thing in place. They could make sure they fully fund shares, and they could be like, great, we're going to do this wage supplement and we're going to put in $20 million, which feels like a big number, except when you look at where we're spending $300 or $400 million in childcare accounts. Right. And so there's sort of a sense of magnitude of investment that is necessary to sort of move the needle on this stuff. In the scheme of the state budget, that is a very doable number, but we got to make sure we're having a conversation that is sort of commensurate with the challenge and the need for sort of substantial action. And I think that becomes harder because the federal government is I don't know, on fire on any given day. And it's super unclear where we're going to land there. And I feel like there's a whole layered conversation about the feds that we also could have, which is where I suspect some of our questions might live too, if we want to sort of draw folks into the conversation and see what they're thinking about.
Yeah, and I know too, and we'll open it up for questions from the group in just a second. The folks that we've gathered as our members of this subcommittee and our champions of early childhood education here. We have a lot of folks from our healthcare sectors, our social services sectors. These are women-dominated sectors, and I worked in both of these sectors for the majority of my professional career. And we would lose a ton of folks for this very reason that, they would have children, and it was that, do I stay at home with my kids? Or, is one parent salary completely going to childcare now? And I've got to make this tough decision of what to do. And so I know these folks are, they have their eyes on the ball here about the importance of it, not only for their employees, but what that means for now. I got to rehire somebody. I got to go through this full process. So I'm curious for the folks on the call as well in terms of, the role the business community can play in terms of shaping and influencing the next couple of months of this process, and how that might come into place. So I think I saw a comment pop up, but let's see if I can get back to, oh, there's a Q&A feature. This is my first time using the webinar feature since Zoom did all their updates here.
Yeah.
So David said, I want to be optimistic that a new child care accounts deal is possible. With that said, are there any credible risk to reduced CCDF support for Wisconsin share at the federal level, specifically via DOGE?
So I think the question is are there credible risks that DOGE and this sort of cost-cutting strategy could impact CCDF? And, you know, I think the default answer to that is absolutely, right? Like universally and across the board. We're still trying to sort out a little bit. You know, the feds announced last week $12 billion in cuts to human services. It sounds like that's mostly going to live in the sort of healthcare side of the house, which is, you know, also a problem. And so there's sort of first stage and second stage concerns. We know there are a couple known knowns. So the Project 2025 document specifically calls out the elimination of Head Start funding, for example. And I think Project 2025 has proven to be a pretty reliable roadmap for policy changes implemented by the administration. So we spent a lot of time around Head Start, around media attention around Head Start. Senator Testa and I went and visited Head Start that the Ho-Chunk runs in Toma, I think 2 weeks ago, you know, just trying to educate members about what the offerings are and why it matters and why it's so important. And Head Start is directly federally funded. So it comes not through us, but directly to the centers. And so they're very vulnerable to changes in federal policy, I would say. In the larger scheme of things, most of our agencies, 60% of what we do is federally funded, but that is not equitably distributed. So like our state money is predominantly in Milwaukee child welfare and a few other activities. All the childcare money is basically federal dollars, for example. All the child support is either TANF money or it's direct, we'll call program revenue. It's from the money people are paying as part of the process. When you look at statewide child welfare, it's mostly through what we call 4E, but it's the Social Security Act. There are different federal laws that sort of fund this, but those programs are all federal dollars. And there, Social Security block grant is a thing that when they were doing their budget instructions, when they were trying to identify what the House was going to do, they called out for the elimination, 10% off of TANF, eliminate SSBG, that Social Security block grant. So we take that roadmap fairly seriously. It might not be exactly where they end up, but we do watch that. So childcare money was not a thing that has been identified broadly in any of those areas. We would expect it to see the kinds of cuts that we would see maybe across the board in programs. So I don't think they're going to eliminate it. That's not an indication we've seen yet, but like if they do eventually reach a deal or do something, could it be 10%, 15%? Totally plausible. So where does that leave us? What does that mean? A couple of things. So the feds passed, I'm going to do a quick 101 on this. The feds do a budget every year. They're supposed to do it in October. They weren't able to do that last time. And they did what they called a continuing resolution. So they punted to December. In December, they punted to March. In March, they punted again to September. They're supposed to pass the 26 budget in October. So are they ever going to pass a budget for this year? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not at this point. What the administration is doing instead is they're using these techniques. DOGE is finding, all these efficiencies, I guess we're going to call them, as they go through the process. And then they're using impoundment and other tools to hold back money. And even Congress is starting to fight back a little bit about this. Part of this budget deal is they were supposed to spend all the money, and they've already said they're not going to do that they're going to hold back cash. A lot of this is designed to get certain decisions in front of the Supreme Court because they're sort of testing the limits of executive power. And in some ways, it's a win for them either way. Either they get to do what they want, or they get the court case in front of the Supreme Court that they want that will sort of at least answer the question of how far can they go. So on the first order things, childcare, I think in general, is less of a target than many of the other areas of the federal budget. Okay, so that doesn't mean we're immune from cuts, but we're sort of caught up with everybody else, with the exception of Head Start, as opposed to a thing that is targeted for elimination, which we do see in certain areas. And so a little bit of good news for us in that universe. The second order problem, though, is if they blow huge holes in the federal, budget that trickle down to the states, that is still a problem for us globally. So if they blow a $500 million hole in Medicaid for Wisconsin, and we got to go back and plug that hole with state money or cut benefits for people, that still sets up, there's only so much GPR to go around. And so that creates what I call the second order problem, which is they're not targeting us, but it turns out you can sink the ship in a different area and we still all go down, if that makes any sense. Kind of a dark metaphor, but like it doesn't have to just impact us. So there's a version of the world where we likely ultimately live on slimmed down federal funding that kind of continue in our lane, but don't make any forward progress because other areas of the budget explode and consume all the resources. There's a world where we're able to try to navigate some of these things and move forward and continue to make, policy choices. The hardest part is the state budget is supposed to get done in July. In the olden days, it sometimes would go till, September or October when you had different houses in control and you had to do conference committees. I've been around long enough that I remember those days. The speaker sort of indicated they might want to wait till they get a Supreme Court ruling on a couple of things. Particularly around the governor's veto. I think he jokingly referred to Emperor Tony in a press release, and I chuckled because, of course, we apparently have very contradictory feelings about executive power depending on which level of government we're in at the moment. But at the end of the day, at some point we got to get a state budget done. And if we don't know exactly what's going to happen in Medicaid or some of these things long term, it's going to be very hard to reconcile that. It could blow up the budget after the fact. We could pass something, and then by the time they finalize 26, we got to go and crack the thing open and redo it or fix it because the feds have made such wildly different decisions than is typical. And so that like hangs over everything that we're doing right
now. Yeah, appreciate that response. Very, very thorough and thoughtful. Jeannie has I think a clarifying question. She says, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that there are more ECE slots, but fewer locations and fewer number of ECE teachers. Could you provide more details on this statement?
Yeah, I don't think I have the numbers in front of me, but what is basically happening is there is a shift from a shrinking portion of the childcare universe is family care. It's down to about 40% of all providers are family care, which is that in-home childcare. We see a shift towards centers, and even among centers towards larger scale centers, better economies of scale, sometimes better wages, but then fewer locations. So I think we were at 5,000 something providers. We're down in the 4,000s today. But the providers we have are licensed for greater capacity post-pandemic than we did pre-pandemic. So there are more slots that are available, but they're at fewer locations. This sort of intensifies that rural access challenge, but sort of reflects what does the world look like when it is operating at scale. The other thing that's hard is about 33,000 slots of childcare can't be used right now because we don't have a licensed educator to put in that room. So the fastest thing we could do to grow capacity would be to use the full footprint, but to do that, we need more staff. And then we could turn those classrooms on and serve more kids.
So it's a slot, but it's an unusable slot because there's no teacher to actually teach the kid.
Right. It's a little bit of a, paper tiger is kind of a negative term, but these slots exist on paper. They're licensed, regulated capacity. There's a room, there's space, it's approved, which means it's furnished and it's ready to go, but there's no body to put it
in. Yeah. We've toured some daycares that were in that exact same situation. As soon as they could hire someone, they could turn the light on and it's ready to go. But right now it's just a dark room. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So most folks have figured out on the webinar the question and answer, but if you haven't yet, there is a question and answer tab at the bottom for you to add your questions. We've probably got time for just a couple more before we wrap, but Kevin has mentioned, he says, does the governor's proposal and the administration's view believe that there are any literacy readiness efforts that could be valuable outside of childcare funding? Or do you believe that the only way to improve literacy readiness is to improve funding for childcare?
No, I would say that there are a number of literacy programs over the last course of the administration. ARPA money was invested in a number of them. The legislature has invested in a number of them. I mean, I think generally the perspective is there are multiple prongs toward literacy readiness. The tension I think that we hear the most about, and this is one I'll just speak to sort of personally, is I think the most visceral thing about early childcare or early education and childcare is the level of access and connection that you can have with your child, with an early care teacher. You know, when you do pick up and drop off and you go into a center and you're having a conversation about your kid's development, if there's speech delays, if there's emotional things that, you know, socio-emotional pieces that are coming up, you have this pretty like intense and direct relationship. And I juxtapose the experience I had with my kids' early care and education teachers with their K-12 teachers, where there's a lot more seat time. My schools are locked down. You know, if you do pick up, kids are coming out or they're taking the bus to and from school. I can't go in and just have a conversation with the teacher. And my kids' teachers are great. And I email them when we have conversations, you know, when we need to. But fundamentally, the relationship is different. And I think one of the things K-12 is really struggling with, and I say this to policymakers too, because they're creating rules that reinforce this. Lots of seat time, lots of testing. Yes, we need more phonics and rigor in the curriculum, but we also see fewer boys going on to college for the first time in a generation. You know, my oldest has ADHD. Seat time is hard for him. Learning modes that involve more physical activity, different kinds of interaction, things that are hands-on. He does better in those spaces. And so we have this dueling, like, literacy is for sure a challenge. And I'm not sure that the approaches that we're taking, even though they're rigorous, are ultimately going to yield things that are overall better for kids. And so when we think about early care in education spaces, when we think about these other community programs and supports that are there for folks, the building of the literacy, I think, has to happen in a variety of different spaces. But we also have to imbue sort of like a love of learning and a love of reading. My youngest kid is struggling with reading. Both my kids struggled with reading. They both have had tutors outside of school. We've used supplemental programs. And it, you know, he's very sporty, he's very athletic, but his perseverance around academics, he really struggles with that. And turning that around is a hard part of this in like a school setting sometimes. And so I will argue all day long. I think the foundations in early care and education and I think community sports are pretty critical in helping kids move forward if they're not already doing well in school.
Great. I should add too, just to fully honor Kevin's question. He also said, thanks very much for the helpful information. Just
Oh yeah.
some positive positive feedback loop there. So Chuck added to his question, or Chuck's question says, thanks, Jeff. You noted earlier that a person looking for a financially fulfilling career choice would be better advised today to look at working at Costco or Quick Trip. Recognize the many challenges in getting there, given our current political environment. Are there any more long-term focused ideas circulating in Madison that might seek to turn this around and make a career in childcare one that would still enable a person choosing it to earn a living wage?
Yeah, I mean, I think the wage supplement conversation is indicative of the fact that people think that's important. I mean, childcare counts as probably roughly worth $2 an hour to staff across the state. And so as the funding disappears in July of 2025, that's a big gap in budgets. It's going to be felt. Most childcare centers are paying the childcare counts money essentially as a bonus rather than a base wage. And so it's going to be real dollars out of people's pockets at a pretty significant level. And so I think that's one of the reasons it's the most politically salient and resonant with folks. Again, for the same reason we saw the elder care conversation. These care-based fields are very like emotionally demanding for folks and they're very low wage. But to your point, I think there is a a bigger problem that, this eclipses a couple of different dimensions. One is sort of the declining power of family wages. Like, people just don't earn relative to the cost of housing and other expenses, the kinds of incomes that they used to. And we see this and we feel this particularly acutely in childcare and elder care, but you see it in other parts of the economy. Wages is a problem. It is driving this very deep-seated thing. It manifests as inflation, it manifests in other things, but like underneath it, it's that people aren't earning enough to keep pace with like the quality of life they expect as an American, even as a middle class American. And that is like a profound problem. I think that's why you see, frankly, the president doing some of the things he's doing, and sometimes the politics of that working. Whether the policy works or not, I mean, I hope so. Like, we're all going over the waterfall together. I hope it gets us where we need to be. But at the end of the day, there's an underlying need for people to be able to earn more for their work, and that being important. And the policy question is sort of like, how do we get there in those pieces? The other challenge to that is underemployment versus unemployment. We have relatively low unemployment. We're really proud of that. We do a great job of getting people into jobs. DWD is knocking it out of the park. We run W-2. We're getting people into work, but a lot of them are still underemployed. So they're working multiple jobs without benefits. And that, again, is a barrier to sort of the family sustaining lifestyle that sort of people envision that they want as Americans. And I think, I'll be honest, I don't think there's a clear policy answer at the state or the federal level. But I think it's sort of the generational issue of our time, is the sense that, people feel like they might be the first generation of Americans worse off than their parents. That's not a great place for people to feel like they're at.
Yeah. All right. So we'll wrap it up with one more question here. So Jorge asks, as a first-time parent of two, ages 5 and 2, I was shocked to encounter 1 and 2 year child care center waiting lists. I also recall the governor's press release stating a Wisconsin child care worker shortage of 33,000 workers. As a longtime nationwide community development funding expert, have you considered tapping into the abundant private community development funding federally mandated to help low and moderate income persons to help solve Wisconsin's childcare dilemma, including childcare workers shortage and new childcare center infrastructure?
So I think that there have been a lot of efforts around sort of financing and connecting community resources, micro lending, other institutions around sort of spinning up childcare. One of the big barriers to family care are things like fences that require, can offer a certain upfront cost. And during the pandemic, we worked actually with the Wisconsin WEDC, Economic Development Corporation, to do some programs that were specifically designed around sort of infrastructure investments for folks, because the federal money that we get typically can't be used in infrastructure pieces. It has to be on direct services. And so I think the kind of partnerships that you're talking about, we've talked a little bit with the Housing Authority about strategies around home ownership and childcare, and childcare as a business, and how can you put those pieces together. We're having some conversations with DISPIS around the regulations, so we could make some changes on our end on childcare regulations. But one of the things you have to do sort of in concert to that, so if you want to be able to serve slightly more kids or in a slightly different way in a home-based setting, is you can't run afoul of the building code. If you do that, it can flip you over into commercial requirements from residential requirements. And that is a whole set of things that sort of become a barrier to that small business ownership in that residential space. And like I said, we sort of made the trainings free to folks. So there's a number of different levers that we've pulled on, but I know you've referenced some of these pieces before. And I think any opportunities to connect more resources with a small business field that we depend on is a great idea.
That's great. That's great. And just for the folks online, we're talking about physical fences around people's property, right? So that it keeps kids in the lawn or in the backyard, right?
Yes.
Right.
Physical fences is like a whole thing.
Yeah. That was also one of the things that I learned over the last few months, was that's one of those big barriers that, like, how do I now afford? I'm trying to become went through this whole process, and now I got to pay for a fence around this property. that's a big barrier for folks. It's kind of that startup cost, that operational cost that can become a barrier for folks.
Totally. And it's like it feels like a thing we should be better at moving through than we are. And I thought there were a couple things in the pandemic I thought we did really well. There were some regulations that we waived. There was some money we were able to put in areas that were strategic in terms of moving people forward as a business operation. I continue to think that those are smart investments. They keep kids safe and they keep the business afloat.
Yeah, yeah. We definitely want to keep kids safe, right? That's the priority. So Secretary Pertl, I really appreciate the time that you've taken with us today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I know the folks on the call, the webinar with us today have valued this conversation as well. I'll be sharing it with the committee. And we look forward to, continuing the relationship and as our committee kind of gets up and running and works on how do we as a business community, as an organization, really truly be advocates for early childhood education. I think we're at a perfect moment to collectively use our voices and truly that's what we intend to do. So I really appreciate the time that you've taken with us today.
Absolutely. And can I close with one just quick thought here?
Absolutely.
As you were saying there, made me think of a conversation I had with Dale Koyenga, and we were talking through this marshaling of businesses. And I think one thing to think about as community leaders and business leaders is sometimes we talk very generically about marshaling business, but there are industries, particularly industries in manufacturing. We see this in agriculture. We see this in direct service. I mean, the grocers, the cheesemakers, the restaurateurs, people who are employing folks who are on the lower end of the wage spectrum, who are more dependent on childcare. Those are the industries that are very actively engaged in this childcare conversation. Apple, the IT industries, they're a little further removed of this. And so, of course, we would love their support. But I think thinking about what is the face of this conversation, even within business is almost too big a universe. Thinking about how does this connect to parts of the economy is a really helpful way to get people engaged in the conversation.
We'll leave it at that. All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.